What do you think about vampires?
You want to drink my blood?
It's a very trusting, intimate experience.
We are talking Bloodthirsty. This is a 1999 movie directed by Jeff Frey and stars Monique Parent as Whitney and Leslie Danon as Celia. You've also got a small cameo appearance from the late Julie Strain as well. Now you might be forgiven thinking it's a standard kind of vampire flick, but in actual fact this is actually more of a psychological thriller about obsession, addiction and blood. It does have horror elements, but it also has elements from other kind of genres as well. In particular, the kind of melodramatic erotica films that we kind of saw in the video shelves in the 90s. What's the story? It focuses on two women. Whitney, played by Monique Parent, is this somewhat aloof but strange woman who lives in this large apartment who is seeking a roommate. Celia, played by Leslie Danon, is this applicant for who wants to kind of live with her. Now she's a kind of a rock chick. She doesn't seem to have much going for her in the way of financial means, but nonetheless Whitney agrees to take her on as a kind of a roommate. And it seems like a great deal. It seems like a really cheap offer. But Whitney has a strange request, and this is obviously why it's so cheap. And she actually reveals to Celia that she's actually a vampire and requests that she is able to drink Celia's blood. Now Celia is obviously a little bit initially kind of disturbed by this, but eventually she agrees. And then things take a little bit of a strange turn when Celia actually starts to become addicted to having her blood taken out of her. You add into the mix Whitney's boyfriend Jim to kind of complicate matters, and then it kind of sets the stage for a kind of somewhat of a almost stage play-like drama. What will happen? You have to watch the movie to find out. So first of all, let's discuss what works with Bloodthirsty. I used to have this on VHS back in the days, and one thing that always struck me and was so visually arresting about this movie was the lighting. The cinematography in this movie is fantastic, and it kind of really emphasises the kind of the spooky and ethereal nature of this movie. I'm going to kind of touch upon that again in just a minute. But this movie, before I come on to that again, I want to talk about this kind of the psychology, so to speak, of this film. Because it's not strictly a horror film by any stretch of the imagination. And it's more of a, as I say, a psychological thriller. The vampirism in this film is treated more like just an addiction to a psychological problem. And the character of Whitney doesn't necessarily seem to have any kind of supernatural abilities or is kind of undead or anything like that. Although, again, the cinematography, which we'll come on to it again, does kind of suggest otherwise. But it's a fascinating look into the psychology of maybe addiction and then kind of obsession when we kind of come to the kind of the other side of the coin, which is Celia's character. And we have these two people with some psychological issues ultimately living together and what kind of path that ends up going on. So it's quite an interesting kind of idea here, and you have this kind of this horror element on top of that. Now what makes this movie interesting, as I say, is you have that kind of that psychological sort of stage set up, but then the way the movie is filmed, it really adds like this kind of like, you sure there's nothing kind of supernatural kind of going on here? For example, when we see the character of Whitney, the director here wisely kind of makes it seem somewhat surreal and gothic looking. For example, the lighting, as I've mentioned, you'll see like there always seems to be like a strip of light just where Whitney's eyes are, but the rest of her in shadow, kind of like a 40s noir type look, which is, you know, it's quite intriguing. It just happens every really time you see Whitney, more or less. The way she's kind of lit just gives it this kind of like this strange supernatural feel. And then you'll have, when she starts to get a little agitated, the lights will flicker and things like this. So it's suggesting that there maybe is kind of something more supernatural, but it's never overtly kind of said to the audience. It's just these visual in-camera effects that kind of just do this. I think it's excellent. I mean, it's one of the kind of things that always struck me about this movie. And I couldn't really remember the story, but I remember these cinematography moments. Now, I actually briefly spoke to Monique Parent before I did this review, because I couldn't really find a hell of a lot of images for this review, and she kind of revealed a couple of things to me about what the director's intent was. And watching this film, you can see it, and essentially the direction that she got is that he wanted her to be pretty much kind of like non-moving. So she's almost corpse-like, where she's kind of just sat down and barely kind of moves, and whenever she speaks, she's always speaking in a soft kind of monotone way, and that was the direction that that she got. And again, it kind of adds to that kind of eerie atmosphere without overtly telling you that that there's something kind of supernatural going on here. So it's a great example of the kind of the mood and the atmosphere kind of doing the work for you, giving this story a kind of a supernatural sheen, when in actual fact it doesn't actually have. When you look at the nuts and bolts of the script, for example, it doesn't actually have a supernatural element in it per se, outside of the fact that this Whitney is a woman where she feels like she has to drink blood to kind of like to feel more confident and to feed her addiction. So I think it's actually quite a fascinating example of good direction or very effective and moody direction, kind of elevating the material. I have to say as well, the performance by both Leslie Dannon and Monique Parent really do emphasise this, because they're played so differently. As I've mentioned, Monique Parent's portrayal here is very subdued. She's always kind of quiet, kind of lurking in the kind of the shadows, and gives it this ethereal feel, whilst the character of Celia is a lot more kind of like unhinged almost, and kind of as the movie progresses she becomes more and more obsessed with Whitney, and you kind of see that in the performances, and things like the camera angles as well again accentuate that. So I think that was all kind of good stuff. The movie kind of plays like a little bit like a stage play. It's all pretty much in one location, this kind of this large apartment, and it certainly has some artistic merit. Okay, so let's talk about what doesn't work. There are a few things story-wise which I feel detracts from the actual story. There is a narration over kind of certain parts of the movie which to me cheapens it, because it kind of feels very exposition heavy and unnecessary, to be honest, and kind of makes it feel like a kind of a crappy TV drama. Also, I have to say the character of Jim, who is Whitney's boyfriend, I don't know if was necessary, and I really didn't feel his character fit with the kind of the other two characters of Whitney and Celia. He just seemed very out of place, and you kind of their relationship seemed quite superficial to me. And if they I think it could have had a better job of making you understand the relationship a little more between Jim and Whitney, because I felt it was kind of underdeveloped, and you didn't really know why he was with her, how much he kind of fed into her, addiction and stuff like that, and kind of what she kind of got out of it outside of sex, is what she says. So I thought that was a little weak. I think some people may be disappointed with the lack of actual horror here. Like I said, it almost feels like this movie does a great job of having a kind of horror-like atmosphere without actually kind of really going into horror. There is a bit of blood sucking and kind of mutilation and stuff like that, but it's very light. It's just the kind of the atmosphere does lend itself quite well to to having horror. This horror tone, far more than some horror films, genuine horror films, I have to say. The movie's maybe a little bit too slow for some, and you kind of feel it's kind of there could have been a little bit more kind of to it in the kind of the script wise. But overall, it has to be said, this movie is certainly a very stylistic movie. with a great eye for a visual treat. This movie is, you know, without having flashy effects and things like this, this movie is visually very, very interesting and some great performances. I just feel maybe the story isn't quite as narratively interesting as it could have been, and ultimately becomes a little bit kind of tired. You feel like you're kind of treading, and it does become a little predictable at times. There's things that happen within the movie, and you just, okay, well that's clearly going to happen a little bit later, and it does, and stuff like that. Overall, you know, it's one of these films which is not going to be for everyone, but if you want to see a good example of some stylish filmmaking, I think could have benefited from a better script, to be honest. But there you go. It's a 5 out of 10 for me. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment, and I shall look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.